The morning the new mistress of Harrowmere was presented to the household, the staff were arranged along the great hall in 2 silent rows, and the woman who curtsied lowest was not the bride. She stood near the foot of the line in a grey stuff gown, her hands folded, her eyes lowered in the way a lady's maid learns before she learns anything else, and when the master of the house walked the length of that hall to look at the woman he had chosen, his gaze passed over the bride in her traveling silk and snagged, for half a breath, Note: on the maid in grey. He did not mean for it to. He did not know yet why it had. To the household assembled that cold November morning, she was nothing more than the new lady's woman. The quiet one brought up from the south, a servant with good hands and no history worth the asking. They had decided what she was inside the first hour. They were wrong about all of it, and the only person in that hall who suspected as much was the man who had just married someone else. Her name was Esther Vane, and she had not come to Harrowmere to serve. Stay with me through this one, because what these 2 women were building in that house was not what any of you will guess. She had come because 8 months earlier, a woman she loved had been buried in a parish without a stone. The man whose carelessness had put her there lived behind these walls, and did not know her face. That was the wound she carried in under her grey gown, folded small, and she had learned to fold it so neatly that it did not show. The bride beside her in the traveling silk was Miss Caroline Ashby, 22 years old, with a fortune her father had built in shipping and a terror of the man she had agreed to marry that she had confessed to no one but the maid who dressed her hair. 2 women had walked into that house with a plan between them, and the plan had nothing to do with love. And that is precisely why what happened next undid them both. The man at the head of the line was Adrian Marsh, the Earl of Harcliffe, and he was 36 years old and had buried a wife of his own 3 years before. The county knew him as cold. The county was not entirely wrong, only incomplete. The way a verdict delivered at a distance is always incomplete. He had married Caroline Ashby for her father's money because the roof of Harrowmere let in the rain in 4 rooms, and the tenants had gone 2 seasons without the repairs their leases promised, and a man who has watched a wife die in a house he could not keep warm learns to make decisions with the part of himself that does not feel. He had chosen Caroline by letter and by ledger. He had not expected to feel anything at all when she arrived. He had not planned on the maid in grey. Caroline took to her rooms the first afternoon and did not come down, and the household read it as the delicacy of a new bride, and Esther read it as exactly what it was, which was fear. She brought the tea up herself. She found Caroline at the window with her traveling cloak still on, looking down at the grey stone court where the carriages had stood, and Caroline said, without turning, that she did not think she could do it. Esther set the tray down. She had known this girl 4 months, since the Ashby household had hired her in London, on the strength of forged references and a steadiness that Caroline's mother had liked, and in 4 months, the 2 of them had moved from mistress and maid to something the world had no clean word for. They had a plan. The plan was that Caroline would marry the Earl and Esther would come north as her woman, and once she was inside the walls, she would find what she had come to find, the truth of how her sister had died. And then the 2 of them would go, quietly, with Caroline's settlement secured and her freedom bought, to a cottage by the sea where no one would ask either of them to be anything they were not. It had seemed clean in London. It did not seem clean now, with the rain coming on and the Earl's footsteps somewhere below them in the house. What Esther had not told Caroline, what she had not told anyone, was the shape of the grief she was carrying. Her sister had been Lydia Vane, and Lydia had been a maid in this house before her, 2 years gone, and Lydia had died of a fever in the cold of an unheated attic room after the household physician was sent for too late, and the name on the order that sent him too late was the Earl's. That was the story Esther had carried north. That was the wound she had folded small. She had come to learn whether the man was cruel or merely careless, and she had told herself the distinction did not matter, and she was about to discover that it mattered more than anything she had ever known. The first week passed in the rhythm a great house keeps in November. Esther dressed Caroline in the mornings and learned the geography of the place in the afternoons, the back stairs and the still room and the long gallery where the dead countess's portrait hung, with its face turned a quarter away from the light. She learned the house the way she had learned every house she had served in, by its small economies and its smaller kindnesses, by which doors stuck in the damp and which servant carried tales to which. The kitchen ran on the word of a cook named Mrs. Fenn, who had been at Harrowmere 30 years, and remembered the late countess as a girl, and it was from Mrs. Blank's Fenn over the paring of apples one wet afternoon that Esther first heard the shape of the household's grief, that the master had not been the same since the winter the mistress died, that he had gone hard and quiet and would not be drawn, and that the steward, Mr. Blease, Cole had taken up the slack of his attention and run the place close ever since. Esther pared apples and listened and said nothing, and filed the steward's name away with the others. The household had its verdict on the new maid, and repeated it among themselves. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dell, said it plainest in the servants' hall over the evening bread, that the southern girl gave herself airs, that she read when she thought no one watched, that a maid who reads is a maid with ideas above her station, and ideas above her station are the first thing to go wrong in a house. A servant with notions, Mrs. Dell said, and nothing more. The others nodded into their cups. Esther heard it through the open door and kept her face still and went on mending the hem in her lap, because she had heard worse, and because the housekeeper was not wrong that she had ideas, only wrong about what they were. She had learned long ago that a still face was a kind of armor, and she had learned it in rooms harder than this one. The Earl she saw rarely, and always from the edge of a room. He took his breakfast alone. He rode the boundaries of the estate in the cold mornings and came back with mud to the knee. He sat with the steward over the account books until the candles guttered, and the household said he was hard about money, and Esther, who had reason to watch how a man spent it, began to notice that the hardness ran all in one direction. He would not buy himself a new horse. He had ordered the tenants' roofs repaired before his own. The 4 rooms where the rain came in were all in the family wing, and the rooms where the servants slept had been the first to get new glass that autumn, and this was not the behavior the story in her chest had prepared her for. She wrote it down in the small book she kept hidden in the lining of her box, the way she wrote everything down, and she did not yet know what to do with it. The witnessing came on the 9th day, though she did not know she was witnessed. There was a boy in the stables, a half-grown lad named Tom, who carried water and took the blame for things that were not his fault because he had no one to speak for him. And on the 9th day, the head groom struck him hard across the face for a lamed horse that had gone lame in the night, through no hand of the boy's. Esther was crossing the yard with Caroline's boots to be cleaned. She did not think. She put the boots down in the wet, and she crossed the yard, and she put herself between the groom and the boy, and she said, in a voice that carried further than she intended, that a horse that lames itself in a cold stall is the fault of the man who did not bed it warm, and that she had been raised to know the difference, and that she would say so to anyone who cared to hear it. The groom stared at her. The boy stared at her. And in the long window of the gunroom above the yard, unseen, a man stood with his hand half raised to the latch, and did not open it, and watched the maid in gray defend a stable boy with a fury that had nothing servile in it at all, and felt something move in him that he had spent 3 years teaching himself not to feel. He did not speak of it. The next morning, all the same, the boy Tom was moved to the kitchen garden under the old gardener, who was kind, and no order was given in anyone's hearing, and Esther understood that the order had been given all the same, and she added that to the small book too. The man was watching her. She had told herself she did not care to be watched. Her hand lifting the pen was not quite steady, and she set that down to the cold. The proximity began to accumulate the way weather accumulates, a pressure before it is a storm. He found reasons to be where she was. He came to the morning room when Caroline was being dressed and stood at the window with his back to them, and spoke of the weather, and Caroline answered him in the bright, frightened voice she used for him. And Esther, kneeling to pin a hem, was aware of exactly where he stood without looking, aware of it the way one is aware of a fire in a cold room. And she despised herself for the awareness and could not stop it. Once he turned and his eyes found her on the floor with the pins in her mouth, and he said, in the level voice the household called cold, that she should not kneel on the stone, that it was bad for the knees in winter. And Caroline laughed and said maids did not feel the cold, and the Earl did not laugh. And he looked at Esther a moment longer than the remark required, and left. Sit on the stool, he had meant. Take care of yourself. She heard only the command. The audience, had there been one, would have heard the rest. I'm going to pause here a moment because some of you have been quiet through this, and I would like to know you are still with me as the house begins to turn. There is more here than a maid and a master, and the turning is close. Now, the third week brought the Dowager. Adrian's mother, the Dowager Countess of Hartcliffe, arrived from Bath with 2 carriages and a companion and a settled intention, and her intention was the rival. Lady Sophia Crewe came in the second carriage, 18 and golden, and arranged like a centerpiece, the daughter of the Dowager's oldest friend. And the Dowager had not been told that her son was already married, because the marriage had been done quietly and quickly, and the Dowager had decided some months before that Sophia Crewe would be the next Countess of Hartcliffe, and had not troubled to ask anyone's opinion of the matter. She swept into the great hall and found a strange young woman in shipping merchant silk being addressed as her ladyship, and her face did a thing that Esther, watching from the gallery stairs, would remember for a long time. The Dowager recovered, because women of her training always recover. She was gracious to Caroline at dinner, in a way that flayed without leaving a mark. She admired the silk, and named its likely price. She asked after Caroline's people, and let the word shipping sit in the air a half-second too long. And when Caroline flustered, knocked a glass, and the red wine bloomed across the white cloth, the Dowager said into the silence that one could always tell that breeding showed itself in the small moments, and that the South sent up such curious girls these days, lady and maid alike. Curious girls. The second voicing, in the public exchange of the dinner table, and this time the rival heard it, and smiled behind her fan, and Caroline's hand shook. And at the foot of the table, the Earl set down his knife with a sound that was very quiet and very final, and said that the cloth could be changed, and that his wife was tired, and that the subject was closed. He did not raise his voice. The Dowager's smile did not move, and yet something had been drawn between mother and son at that table. A line, and everyone present felt it without being able to name it. That night Caroline wept, and said the plan was breaking, that the Dowager would never let them be, that the Earl frightened her even when he was kind, because she could not read him. Esther held her, and did not say what she was beginning to understand, which was that the Earl frightened her too, but not in the way Caroline meant, and that the 2 fears were opposite fears, and that this was a complication the London plan had not contained. She brushed out Caroline's hair by the one candle they allowed themselves, and she thought of the cottage by the sea, and found, for the first time, that the image had gone thin, like a painting left in the sun. The midpoint came in the long gallery, in the cold blue hour before the house was awake, where Esther had gone to look again at the portrait of the dead Countess, with its face turned from the light. She had wondered at that turn. A vain man hangs his dead wife square to the window. This portrait had been hung deliberately askew, and she had begun to suspect why, and she was standing before it when the Earl came in behind her, and she had nowhere to go. He did not order her out. He stood beside her and looked at the painted woman a long moment, and then he told her in a voice she had not heard him use, the thing the household did not know. His wife had not died of a fever, the way the county believed. She had died in childbed in a hard winter, and the road to the physician had been 6 hours under snow, and he had been in London when the message came, kept there. By business he had judged more pressing than a confinement that was not due for a fortnight, and he had come home to a grave already filled. He had hung the portrait askew because he could not bear to be looked at by her, and could not bear to take her down. Where, he said all of this, levelly the way he said everything, and only his hand, resting on the cold sill, betrayed him. the knuckles gone white. He had a daughter, 2 years old, kept in the nursery wing, whom he visited and could not speak to, because she had his wife's eyes, and he had not been there. The wound was named once. He turned and left her in the gallery, and Esther stood before the painting with the whole architecture of her grief shifting under her like ice on a river in the thaw, because here was the thing she had come to learn, and it was not the thing she had believed. The order that had sent the physician too late for her sister Lydia, the order with the Earl's name on it, had been given in the same winter, the winter his wife died, the winter he was destroyed and absent, and a steward she had not yet met was running the house with a free hand and a hard ledger. She had carried north a story of a careless, cruel man. She was finding a grieving one, and a steward, a man named Cole, whose name was on more of the household's cold economies than the Earl's was, and she did not know yet what to do with the difference, only that it changed everything and that she had begun to want it to. The proximity scenes deepened after the gallery, because something had been given and could not be taken back. He found her in the library 3 days later, where she had no business being, reading a book she had no leave to take, a worn volume of letters pulled down from a low shelf, and instead of the rebuke she braced for, he asked her what she made of it, and she told him plainly, because she was past pretending she could not read. And he did not flinch from the plainness, and they talked. 2 people in a cold room full of leather and dust, longer than either of them had meant to. He asked her where she had learned her letters, and she said her father had been a curate before he died, a poor one, who had taught both his daughters to read, because he had nothing else to leave them, and the word daughters hung in the air between them, and he did not pursue it, but she saw that he had heard it and set it aside to keep. He came upon her in the nursery wing once, where she had begun to go in the afternoons because the little girl, Anne, had taken to her, and he stood in the doorway and watched his daughter laugh at something the maid in gray had said, a sound he had not heard the child make in months, and his face when Esther looked up was not cold at all. "Come and sit with her tomorrow," he said. It was a command. It was the only way he knew to ask. She heard the command. She was beginning, slowly, to hear the rest, and the hearing frightened her more than the dowager ever had. There was a moment in the library, a week after that. She did not write in her small book, because she had no words for it that the book would hold. He had reached past her for a volume on a high shelf, and his arm had been a moment at her shoulder, not touching, near enough that she felt the warmth of him through the cold air, and neither of them had moved, and the candle had thrown both their shadows long across the spines, and she had been aware of his breath, and her own, and the space between them that was the whole width of everything they were not permitted. Her hand had risen of its own accord, and stopped a half-inch from his sleeve and hung there, and she had made herself lower it. He had seen it rise. He had seen it stop. She watched him watch her hand and watched the thing it cost him to step back, the deliberate hard motion of a man overruling his own body. And then he had stepped back with the book and said, "Good night, Miss Vane," in a voice gone rough at the edges. And she had stood in the dark library after he was gone, with her hand pressed flat against her own breastbone, as though to hold something in. "I should not want this," she thought, and then, with the honesty that frightened her, "I want it anyway." She let herself know it for one unguarded breath in the dark, the whole shape of it, the way she would have leaned the half-inch and crossed the country between them, if the world had been a different world, and then she folded it away with the rest, because she was a maid, with a false name, in a dead woman's house. And want was a country she had no passport to enter. The dowager was not idle while the house turned. She had taken the measure of the situation with the speed of a woman who had survived 40 years of drawing rooms, and she had seen what her son's face did when the gray maid crossed a room, and she had seen the bride's terror and the bride's strange dependence on her own servant, and she had begun quietly to pull threads. She summoned Esther to her sitting room on a pretext of a torn flounce, and kept her standing while she sewed and spoke, in the polished hierarchy protective voice that wounds without a mark, of the dangers a clever servant courts when she forgets her place, of how easily a girl with no people and no history might find herself turned out without a character, of how the South was full of girls who had reached above themselves and come to grief. She did not look up from her needle as she spoke. She let the silences do half the work the way a skilled woman does, and she let her gaze rest. When it rested at all on Esther's hands, on the cleverness of them, the wrongness of such hands on such a person. "You are a curious girl," she said, the third voicing, in the private aside of the sitting room with the door shut and no witness but the rival who sat in the corner with her embroidery and her small, cold smile. "I have lived a long time," the dowager went on, "and I have watched a great many people pretend to be what they are not, and I will tell you what I have learned, that they are always found. I wonder," she said, "what a girl like you came all this way to find." And Esther, who had folded her grief so small for so long, felt it press against the fold, felt the old fever-cold attic and the parish without a stone rise up behind her eyes, and said only that she had come to serve her mistress, your ladyship? And the dowager smiled and said of course, and let her go. And both of them knew the conversation had been a blade laid flat against the throat, turned once, and sheathed. Esther walked the cold corridor back to Caroline's rooms, with her hands steady and her heart going like a hammer, and understood that she was no longer hunting in this house. She was being hunted. It was Caroline who broke first, and not from malice, but from terror. The dowager worked on her, too, over a fortnight, in small kindnesses and smaller cruelties, until the frightened girl was half persuaded that her own maid was the danger, that the Earl's strange attention to the household, his gentleness in the nursery, his closed face at the dinner table, all of it ran back somehow to Esther. And that if Esther were gone, the dowager would be satisfied, and the marriage would be safe, and the terror would stop. Caroline did not understand what she was holding. She only wanted the fear to end. And so on a gray afternoon in December, with the dowager's voice fresh in her ears, she said a thing to the dowager that she should not have said, a thing about forged references and a false name, and a girl who was not what she claimed, because Caroline knew that Much had always known it, had agreed to it in London as part of their plan. And now, in her fear, she spent it like a coin. The dowager's eyes lit. She had her thread. She pulled. The dark moment came at the Christmas gathering, in the great hall where the household had first arranged itself in 2 silent rows. The neighborhood had been invited, the same county that had delivered its verdict on the cold Earl years before, and the candles were lit the length of the hall, and the dowager rose with a glass in her hand as though to give a toast, and instead gave an exposure. She named the maid before them all. She said that there was a deceiver in the house, a servant who had come under a false name and forged papers, who had wormed her way into the confidence of a frightened bride and the household of an honorable family, and that she had taken the liberty of writing to certain people in the South, and that the truth was uglier than mere ambition. For the girl had a grievance, a dead sister, a thirst for the family's ruin, dressed up as service. She turned to Esther where she stood frozen at the edge of the candlelight. "Tell them your name," she said. "Tell them what you came here to do." The hall went silent, the way a struck bell goes silent at the very end of its sound. The rival watched with her fan, half lifted. Caroline had gone white, and was looking at the floor. And the Earl at the head of the hall had risen, and his face had closed like a door. And Esther looked at that closed face and believed, in that moment, that she had lost the only thing in this house she had come, against all her planning, to want. She did not deny it. That was her active choice, made in the space of one breath, and it was the bravest thing she had done, in a house that had asked much of her courage. She lifted her head, and she told them the truth, all of it, in a voice that did not shake, though her hands did. Her name was Esther Vane. Her sister had been Lydia Vane, who had died in this house, in the cold of a fever. The physician came too late to break, and the order that delayed him had borne the Earl's name, and she had come north to learn whether the man who signed it was cruel or careless. She had come, she said, hating him. She looked at the dowager, and then she looked once at the Earl, and she said that she had learned the man had not signed it, that the hand behind that order and a dozen others was the steward Cole's, that she had the proofs in a book in her box, and that the cruelty she had crossed 3 counties to find had never lived in the Earl at all. Then she stopped. She had nothing left to spend. She stood in the candlelight and waited to be turned out into the snow, and the hall waited with her, and the silence stretched until it was a physical thing in the room. The reversal did not come as rescue. It came as recognition, and it came slowly, the way the man did everything. The Earl came down the length of the hall past the Dowager, with her glass still raised, past the rival, past the white-faced bride, and the county turned to watch him cross the floor they had watched him cross as a cold widower years before, and he stopped before the maid in gray. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at Esther. He asked her quietly, in the voice the household called cold, and she had learned to call something else, whether the proofs were real, and she said they were. And he was silent a moment, and then he said the thing that turned the room. Then Cole answers for both their deaths. Caroline's, he meant, and the dead Lydia's, named together. The wife and the maid. The 2 women the cold of this house had taken while a steward kept the ledgers and a master grieved with his eyes shut. He said it for the whole hall to hear. He had taken her account, the maid's account, over his own stewards, over his own mother's, in front of the county that had judged him, and he had done it not as a man defending a servant, but as a man naming a wrong. The dowager's glass came down, her composure, the work of 40 drawing rooms, cracked along a line, and did not mend. She said her son's name once, and then again, and could not find the sentence to follow it. The rival had lowered her fan. And in the corner, the steward Cole, who had not expected the maid's book, and had not expected to be named in his own master's hall, had already begun quietly to move toward the door, and found the Earl's 2 largest footmen standing in it. It was Caroline who finished what her fear had begun, because she was not, underneath the terror, a coward. She stepped into the broken silence, and she took Esther's hand before them all, and she said, in a voice that found its steadiness as it went, that everything the dowager had said about a false name was true, and everything she had implied about its purpose was a lie. That this woman had been her truest friend in a marriage she had entered in fear, and that she would not stand in a hall and watch her be slandered. She turned to the Earl, her husband, the man she had been too frightened to read, and she found that she could read him now, and what she read was not anger. The plan that 2 women had carried into this house lay in pieces on the candlelit floor, and out of the pieces, something truer was assembling itself, and all 3 of them stood inside the assembling and felt it happen. What followed was procedure, and procedure is what makes a reversal hold. The steward Cole was given to the magistrate with Esther's book of small, careful entries as the spine of the case against him, the orders he had signed in the Earl's name, the economies he had skimmed, the physician's fee he had pocketed in the winter 2 women died. The family solicitor, a dry, careful man named Pelham, who came up from London in the new year, sat 3 days in the cold study, going through the ledgers line by line, and what he found confirmed every entry in the maid's hidden book, and more besides a slow, patient theft conducted across 3 years under cover of a master. He had counted on the grief, Pelham said. The steward had counted on it the way a man counts on weather, and it had held for 3 winters, and would have held for 30 if a curate's daughter had not come north with a grievance and a sharp eye, and written down what she saw. The marriage between Caroline and the Earl, never consummated, entered upon by 2 frightened people for reasons that had nothing to do with each other, was quietly and lawfully set aside in the months that followed through a process Pelham managed with discretion, the settlement secured to Caroline entire. Her freedom bought, as the London plan had always intended, though the cottage by the sea was now hers alone, to want or not. She wrote to Esther through the spring long bright letters from the coast, and signed them with her own name and no fear in it at all. The dowager returned to Bath. She did not apologize, because women of her training do not, but she wrote to her son in the spring a letter that was for her very nearly an apology, and he answered it, which was for him very nearly forgiveness. and the line drawn between them at the dinner table grew, over years, into something a family can live across. And Esther stayed. Not as a maid, and not at once, and not without a long, careful courtship, conducted mostly in the library among the leather and the dust. Two people who had each been certain they would never be chosen, learning slowly to believe the evidence of their own eyes. He used her name, Esther, he said the first time deliberately in the gallery before the portrait he had finally hung square to the light, and the saying of it was a marked thing, a door opening, that had been shut 3 years. She heard the whole of it now. She had learned to hear the rest. The following winter the snow came early to Harrowmere, and lay clean across the grey stone court where the carriages had once stood in 2 silent rows. In the nursery wing the fire was lit, and the little girl Anne, 3 years old now and quick with laughter, sat on the hearthrug, while the woman who was not her mother and had become her mother read to her in the warm light. Esther had her small book still, the one from the lining of her box, but it held different entries now. Household things, a child's first words, the date, the roof was finished at last. On the mantel above the fire stood a thing she had brought north folded small, and had not shown anyone for a long time. A miniature of her sister Lydia, painted cheap in a southern fair, the summer before she came to service, the only likeness that survived her. Esther had set it where the firelight reached it. The Earl came in from the cold with snow on his shoulders, and stood in the doorway a moment the way he had once stood watching his daughter laugh, and then he crossed the room and sat on the floor beside them, both which no one in the county would have believed, of the cold Earl of Hartcliffe, and the child climbed into his lap. And outside the snow went on falling past the window that Esther had come by the longest road to call her own. The miniature caught the light. Lydia's painted face looked out over the warm room, no longer turned from it, and was at the last no longer the only thing Esther carried. Thank you for staying to the end of this one. If Esther's long road north moved you in any way, leave a word below for the women the world decided not to see, and I will read every one of them.